Why does Christina Hoff Sommers really call herself a feminist? I honestly don't really know, so I'm just gonna kind of riff about it a little bit. Hey everybody, it's Prince of Queens, and I was thinking today about Christina Hoff Sommers, who I've definitely enjoyed a lot of her work in the past. I've liked a lot of her videos, I've shared a lot of her videos. I find them extremely convenient in getting short messages across to people about feminism. In particular, I've shared the video, Do Men Need to Check Their Privilege? And the one called Intersectional Feminism, What Is It? Those are great, short, informative videos, or they were. I think that there's been some better work done since about intersectionality and intersectional feminism, but it was really good when it came out at the time. It helped me a lot. And the Do Men Need to Check Their Privilege? It goes through many statistics very quickly, and so it's just a very useful kind of an index resource in terms of introducing people to male issues. Christina Hoff Sommers is somebody that I've shown to my mother before numerous times, and actually my father, now that I think about it, and both of them said that she seemed very reasonable and they liked her, and my mother definitely kind of, I don't want to put words into her mouth, but she said things like, see, that's the type of feminism that I remember. Which I think for the most part is probably true coming from my mother, because while my mother definitely considered herself a feminist during the 70s and 80s, I remember her being subscribed to Ms. Magazine, at the same time, she didn't spend a whole lot of time blathering on about feminism and actually reading feminist theory texts, and she generally was dating men or married to a man. And so I just imagine, knowing feminists as much as I do, that my mother didn't actually really understand just how man-hating feminists were even back then. Paul Elam actually made this point about Christina Hoff Sommers, who acted like she came from the equity school of feminism from the second wave, and that back in the second wave, everything was cool and that feminists were nice. But according to Paul, who was around back then, he didn't seem to think so. He's been over the information, and from his recollection, most of the feminists that were around in the second wave were also man-hating, patriarchy smashing, or gender abolitionists, or whatever, extreme radical man-haters, as they tend to always be. So either she's just not remembering correctly, or she's purposefully rewriting history, which I don't really want to believe she is. I want to believe that she's somebody maybe a little bit more like, I don't know, maybe like my mother, but again, I don't really want to put too many experiences onto my mother because I'm not my mother. But there's a lot of women out there who naively call themselves feminists simply because they don't really know anything about feminism. And I have literally seen feminists be really, really mean to women like that on the internet and start swearing at them because these women didn't hate men enough. I've seen, and this was back in, 2015, 2016, when feminists thought that they were going to take over the entire world and that men were, I don't know what they thought was going to happen to men. I've seen feminists tell women that they needed to be harder on men and that she was too nice and that maybe she should stop dating men entirely just because reasons. I've seen that. So I know that that attitude exists, but I also know that a lot of feminists, they maybe kind of want to say that, but they figure, it's better to have one more name on the list of people who call themselves feminists. So if they know that a woman calls themselves a feminist, like if she calls herself a feminist, but she has a boyfriend or a husband and she doesn't hate men, and they know that they're not going to be able to convince her to hate men, well, they might as well just not really say anything. But they'll hope that maybe she breaks up with her boyfriend, and then they'll move in, and they'll try to make sure that she hates men as much as possible, because that's how they work. They use these type of emotional manipulation and uh, just sort of female strategical ways of getting people on their team through finding vulnerable moments. I guess men do that too. I shouldn't say it's entirely just a female thing, but I would say that feminists are nothing without that type of emotional manipulation, so it's common. That being said, I want to believe that Christina Hoff Sommers was that type of person who just simply didn't know any better until she took that fateful gig as a feminist philosophy teacher that inspired her to start critiquing feminism. And then that kind of became the career that she ended up with the A.E.I, where she criticized feminism for a living ever since the 90s or so, maybe the late 80s, I'm not really sure. That's been her career, but she's maintained calling herself a feminist. Except for she's not a feminist, right? She's totally just not. Like, she does not talk about smashing the patriarchy. She doesn't talk about anything that feminists really talk about. Paul Elam was able to sift long and hard and find the needles in the haystack that look like she's a feminist in some ways. And I'm not going to say that Paul's entirely wrong, because he could be totally right. Paul's actually a very smart guy, and he's a nice guy. I've talked to him before. Nothing against Paul. But still, the majority of her work is men's rights advocating. She criticizes feminism, and she does talk about how boys are suffering a lot. So as far as I'm concerned, I think that she's pragmatically more of an MRA. I do. I think that that's a fair thing to say. I think that if it looks like a squirrel, and it eats nuts like a squirrel, and it climbs up trees like a squirrel, but it calls itself a feminist, well, then it's some sort of non-binary otherkin Christina Hoff Sommers or something. So it's weird, right? It's just kind of strange. We can all admit it. So I'm trying to think about why. Why is it? And Paul Elam brought up a really decent point, which is that she refuses basically to disavow her sisters. And I understand that completely. And I'm wondering if it's, and this is just, the few thoughts in my head. Is it because of marketing? Is it because she thinks in her head that she will be most effective advocating for the gender-specific issues of men and boys if she calls herself a feminist? Therefore, people will take her seriously. Perhaps in her head, she believes that if and only if she calls herself a feminist, she can be taken seriously as a gender critic and gender data compiler in the mainstream. Because over the past 30 years or so, you could not have a career talking about gender if you did not talk about feminism. You had to be a registered feminist in order to have a public platform. So maybe she figured that was the better move, right? But here's the thing that I'm wondering about now. So she had to kind of do that. She was keeping her foot in the door of the sisterhood clubhouse. Like, she was a double agent. This is just a theory. Maybe she was a double agent the whole time, keeping her foot in the door so that she could advocate for the gender-specific issues of men and boys while using the feminist label and saying that they're doing everything wrong. That's sort of the surface explanation. Or you could take Paul Elam's explanation for what he thinks is going on, and it would be a lot less charitable towards her, and it would be something more to the effect of, well, Christina Hoff Sommers is really just doing this so that she can deny accountability coming from feminism for all of the awful things feminism has done and entrenched into law over the years. Like, feminism already won every single battle that it attempted to engage with. And then here comes Christina Hoff Sommers to say, oh no, that wasn't really feminism's fault. That's not because of feminism. That's because of the bad people who they're not. That's not what feminism is to me, guys. What feminism really is just me, 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 me. That's what Paul Elam thinks about her. I'm not sure which to believe. I'm not sure whether or not she's a double agent for our side or whether or not she's a double agent for the feminist side. And when I say our side, I mean just gender fairness overall. Or maybe she's just some big old feminist apologist or something, like Paul Elam seems to think. But here's what I'm going to propose, and this is a proposition to Christina, in case she ever watches this video. Maybe somebody has said something like this to her in the past, but I'm going to say it again. If you really are for equality and fairness and not some sort of subtle envelope pushing of female supremacy that you're working your little part in by apologizing for all of the heinous developments of feminism in the Western world over the past 50 years or so, if you really are what you say you are in terms of wanting gender equality and fairness for boys, and that you don't actually just want boys to serve women, which granted isn't necessarily a horrible thing because men and women serve each other, but if you really, really, really do want fairness, and that's it, I think it might just be the time to put the word feminism to rest and come up with a new sisterhood and just say, hey, there is no purpose in calling oneself a feminist, and you, Christina Hoff Sommers, could start some new organization of women's rights advocates or something. And I don't know what you would focus on. Rights for women in the third world or something, trying to get birth control legalized in Somalia or something. I don't know. But if you did that with all of your public prominence and tried to market yourself as the person who really, really cares about women and also men, and that you really, really, really do want gender equality and fairness for everybody, you could create a new tribalistic label for women so that they could feel that they are still a part of the sisterhood. They would still have a way to identify themselves by being a part of whatever, let's say it's the International Women's Rights Community or something. International Women's Right. I rock. Oh, that sounds strange. I rock. But, come up with an acronym that's catchy. And then women could start calling themselves that. That's what we did. Gay guys did that. Gay guys who aren't feminists, who are no longer a part of the LGBTQIA++, we're calling ourselves GigTows now, which stands for gays going their own way. Well, you could come up with some sort of version of what you say that feminism supposedly used to be and have a new name for it. And therefore, it would offer an alternative to feminism. And you're big enough to do that with the power of the internet and the awful, awful state of contemporary feminism and how uncool it is at this very moment. You, Christina Hoff Sommers, you as an individual, you can do it. You could end everything that's wrong with feminism by coming up with a new thing that's supposed to just sort of focus on women's issues. And sure, maybe it could get perverted and become a female supremacist organization eventually, but you could be that breaking point where women, like, I don't know, maybe my mother, might separate and have a new tribalistic female-centered label to associate themselves with as a personal label, where they get to feel like they're not abandoning their sisters, but they still have something, but it's just not feminism anymore. You could do that, Christina Hoff Sommers. And I think you should, if your money is where your mouth is. Okay, bye.